It started as a regular weekend camping trip. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks, looking forward to some time away from our busy lives in Dallas. We chose Blue River State Park in Oklahoma, a place none of us had visited before but had heard great things about. The park was known for its scenic beauty and the peaceful Blue River that flowed through it, ideal for a relaxing getaway. We set off on a Friday afternoon, 5 of us crammed into my old SUV, packed with camping gear, food, and the essentials for a weekend in the wilderness. The drive was smooth, filled with the usual banter and laughter. As we crossed into Oklahoma, the scenery changed from the urban sprawl of Dallas to lush greenery and open skies. It was refreshing. By the time we arrived at the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. We checked in at the ranger station, got our campsite assignment, and drove to our designated spot. It was a secluded area near the river, surrounded by tall trees that whispered with the evening breeze. It seemed perfect. We quickly set up our tents and got a fire going. As night fell, we cooked dinner over the fire, shared stories, and enjoyed the tranquil ambience of the park. The stars were incredibly bright, a stark contrast to the light-polluted skies of the city. It was exactly what we had hoped for. The first night passed without incident. We woke up to the chirping of birds and the gentle sound of the river flowing nearby. After breakfast, we decided to explore the park. There were several hiking trails, and we chose one that promised a scenic view of the river from a high vantage point. The hike was invigorating, the fresh air filling our lungs, and the beauty of nature surrounding us. We took plenty of photos and enjoyed the breathtaking views from the overlook. By lunchtime, we were back at our campsite, tired but happy. In the afternoon, we decided to do some fishing. The Blue River was known for its trout, and we were eager to try our luck. We spent hours by the riverbank, casting our lines and chatting about everything and nothing. Time seemed to slow down, and for a while it felt like we were the only people in the world. As evening approached, we noticed the weather changing. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up. We decided to head back to our campsite and prepare for the possibility of rain. By the time we got there, the sky was an ominous shade of gray. We secured our gear and huddled under a makeshift tarp shelter as the first drops of rain began to fall. What started as a light drizzle quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The rain was relentless, drumming on the tarp and turning the ground into a muddy mess. We were soaked and cold, but we tried to make the best of it, telling jokes and trying to keep our spirits up. The rain continued through the night. We barely slept, the sound of the storm and the discomfort of being wet keeping us awake. By morning, the rain had stopped, but everything was drenched. Our campsite was a swampy mess, and we were all exhausted. Despite the rough night, we decided to stay. We were determined to enjoy our trip, and the weather forecast promised clearer skies for the rest of the weekend. We spent the day drying out our gear, fishing some more, and exploring a different trail. The park was beautiful, and the experience was worth the discomfort. That evening, as the sun set and the sky cleared, we built another fire and settled in for a more comfortable night. We were all looking forward to a good night's sleep. Little did we know that our peaceful weekend was about to take a terrifying turn. Late into the night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was a rustling sound, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the river. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But as I lay there listening, the sound grew louder and more persistent. It was as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush, getting closer to our campsite. I sat up and strained to see through the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees and the shadowy outline of the river beyond. My heart began to race as the rustling grew closer, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig. I reached over and shook my friend Alex, who was sleeping in the tent next to me. He groggily asked what was wrong, and I told him to listen. He sat up and we both stayed still, ears straining to catch any sound. The rustling had stopped. We waited, tense and silent, for what felt like an eternity. Just as we were starting to think it was our imagination, we heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. Something was moving through the bushes and it was heading straight for us. Alex grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. We could still hear the rustling, but we couldn't see anything. It was unnerving. We woke the others, and we all gathered around the dying fire, clutching our flashlights and trying to figure out what to do. The noise continued, now circling our campsite, always just out of sight. It was as if, whatever it was, it knew exactly how to stay hidden. We decided to stoke the fire, hoping the light would scare off whatever was out there. As the flames grew, casting long shadows and illuminating the surrounding area, the rustling stopped again. We stood there, hearts pounding, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and the silence was deafening. We were about to relax, thinking the worst was over, when we heard a new sound. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. It sent chills down my spine. We shone our flashlights in the direction of the growl, but again we saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. It was followed by a sound that made my blood run cold, a deep, throaty laugh full of malice and cruelty. We were all on edge, trying to peer into the darkness, but seeing nothing. The laughter echoed through the trees, and then everything went silent. It was the most terrifying silence I had ever experienced, heavy and oppressive. We huddled together, too scared to move, barely daring to breathe. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Finally, as dawn began to break, the sound stopped altogether. The first light of day brought a sense of relief, but also a deep, unsettling feeling. Something was out there, something that had been watching us, toying with us. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed up our gear and left the campsite. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing the fear and the inexplicable events of the night. We decided to cut our trip short and head back to Dallas. The drive back was quiet. We were all exhausted and eager to get home. When we finally reached the city, we parted ways, each of us grateful to be back in familiar surroundings. I haven't been camping since that trip to Blue River State Park. The memory of that night still haunts me. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that something was stalking us, something that enjoyed our fear. And that is enough to keep me far away from the woods. I wanted to share a story about a camping trip that went terribly wrong. This happened last summer, and I still get chills thinking about it. My buddies and I planned a trip to Red River Gorge in Kentucky. We were all pretty excited because it's known for its amazing hiking trails and beautiful scenery. Plus, it's kind of a tradition for us to go camping every year. There were 5 of us, me, Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily. We've all been friends since college, and we've had our fair share of adventures together. We packed our gear, stocked up on supplies, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The drive was uneventful, and we reached the campground by late afternoon. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent the evening cooking hot dogs and marshmallows. Everything seemed perfect. The first night was pretty normal. We stayed up late, talking and laughing around the campfire, and then turned in for the night. I woke up a few times because of the usual sounds you hear in the forest: rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional crack of a branch. Nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, we decided to hike one of the longer trails, a loop that would take us past some of the most scenic spots in the gorge. We packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and a first aid kit just in case. The hike started off great. The weather was perfect and the views were incredible. We stopped several times to take photos and enjoy the scenery. About halfway through the hike, we came across an old, overgrown trail that didn't look like it had been used in years. It wasn't on our map, but Jake, always the adventurous one, suggested we explore it. After some convincing, the rest of us agreed. The trail was narrow and difficult to navigate, with branches and bushes making progress slow. As we ventured further, the atmosphere started to change. It got quieter and the air felt thicker. I can't explain it, but something just felt off. We kept going, though, because we were curious where the trail led. After about an hour, we stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, with moss covering the wooden walls and the roof partially caved in. We were intrigued and decided to check it out. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside was filled with debris and broken furniture. There were old newspapers scattered around, dating back to the 1970s. It was eerie, but also fascinating. We spent some time poking around, but eventually we decided to head back to the main trail. That's when things started to get weird. On our way back, we realized we were lost. The trail we had been following seemed to disappear, and we couldn't find any markers or signs to guide us. We tried retracing our steps, but it felt like we were going in circles. Panic started to set in as the daylight began to fade. We were tired, thirsty, and running low on energy. We had no choice but to set up a makeshift camp and wait until morning. We didn't have our tents with us, so we built a small fire and tried to get some rest. It was a long, uncomfortable night. Every sound in the darkness seemed amplified, and none of us slept much. The next morning we were exhausted but determined to find our way back. We packed up and started walking again, hoping to find the main trail. After a few hours, we came across a creek. We followed it, thinking it would lead us to the river and eventually back to the campground. As we followed the creek, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There was a small clearing with a makeshift campfire and some old, tattered blankets. But that wasn't the worst part. Scattered around the site were dozens of animal bones. Some looked like they had been there for years, while others seemed more recent. We had a sinking feeling that we were not alone. The thought of someone else being out here watching us was terrifying. We quickly moved on, trying to put as much distance between us and that clearing as possible. The creek eventually led us to the river, and after several more hours of walking, we finally found the main trail. We were relieved, but also exhausted and on edge. We made it back to our campsite just before sunset. We were too tired to do much, so we just ate a quick meal and went to bed. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every noise made me jump, and I kept thinking about the abandoned cabin and the clearing with the bones. The next day we decided to cut our trip short. We packed up our gear and headed home. The ride back was quiet. None of us really wanted to talk about what had happened. It felt like a bad dream, but it was all too real. Looking back, I wish we had never taken that old trail. Something about that place wasn't right, and it still haunts me. I've been camping many times since then, but I always stick to the marked trails and avoid exploring unknown paths. You never know what you might find, or what might find you. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. Just me, the wilderness, and some much-needed peace and quiet. I decided on the Olympic National Park in Washington. The dense forests, winding trails, and scenic beauty had always called to me. I packed my gear, checked my maps, and set off for a week of solitude. The first couple of days were perfect. I set up my tent near a small creek, fished for my meals, and spent my evenings by the campfire reading and reflecting. On the third day, I decided to take a long hike. I had my GPS, a physical map, and plenty of supplies. My plan was to hike out to a remote spot I had read about and return by nightfall. The trail was more challenging than I expected. Overgrown paths and fallen trees made navigation tricky. But the beauty of the forest, with its towering pines and lush undergrowth, kept me motivated. I crossed streams, climbed ridges, and pushed deeper into the wilderness. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I had been aiming for, a clearing with a stunning view of the mountains. I sat down to rest, eat some lunch, and take in the scenery. It was everything I had hoped for. After an hour or so, I decided to head back. The return trip would take a few hours, and I wanted to be back before dark. As I retraced my steps, I noticed the forest seemed different. The shadows were longer and the air felt cooler. I checked my GPS, but the signal was weak. I pulled out my map and compass, but the landmarks I had noted earlier didn't match up. Panic started to creep in. I had been hiking for hours, but it felt like I was getting nowhere. I pushed forward, hoping to find a familiar spot. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find shelter soon. My water was running low, and my legs were aching. Every rustle in the underbrush and every snap of a twig put me on edge. I kept telling myself it was just the wildlife, but my nerves were frayed. As darkness fell, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't ideal, but I decided to set up camp there. I built a fire and pitched my tent, trying to stay calm. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I tried to sleep, but every sound jolted me awake. The next morning, I was determined to find my way back. I packed up and started hiking, using the rising sun as my guide. The forest felt like a maze. I walked for hours, but there was no sign of the trail I had taken. The trees seemed denser, the undergrowth thicker. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and scared. Around midday, I found a stream. Relief washed over me as I filled my water bottle and drank deeply. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to a larger body of water or a familiar landmark. The terrain was rough and the going was slow. I slipped on moss-covered rocks and tripped over roots, but I kept moving. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of civilization. My mind raced with thoughts of being lost forever. I tried to stay positive, reminding myself that I had prepared for emergencies. But the reality of my situation was sinking in. I was alone, miles from anywhere, and running out of options. As evening approached, I found another small clearing and set up camp. I built a fire and huddled close to it, trying to stave off the chill. My thoughts turned to my family and friends. They would start to worry soon, but it could be days before anyone came looking for me. I had to stay strong and keep moving. The night was restless. I woke up several times, heart pounding at every sound. The forest seemed alive with unseen creatures. I kept my knife close, just in case. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I packed up and started hiking again, following the stream and praying it would lead me somewhere. The forest seemed to go on forever. I lost track of time, my focus solely on putting one foot in front of the other. My stomach growled and my limbs felt heavy. I was rationing my food, but it wouldn't last much longer. I needed to find a way out, and soon. Late in the afternoon, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of an engine. I followed the noise, my heart pounding with hope. The sound grew louder, and I pushed through the underbrush, emerging onto a dirt road. Relief flooded over me. I had found a logging road. I followed the road, hoping it would lead me to help. As I walked, I thought about how close I had come to losing hope. The road was rough, but it was a clear path, and that was all that mattered. I kept moving, driven by the promise of safety and the thought of seeing my loved ones again. The road eventually led me to a logging camp. The workers were surprised to see me, and they offered food and water. I told them my story, and they radioed for help. Within a few hours, I was being driven back to civilization, weak but grateful. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.